Hey everyone, I just want to address very quickly another facet of the discussion that has taken shape in the country ever since last week's horrific racist massacre, gun massacre, at an African American church in Charleston, South Carolina. Apparently, the atrocity rather, has spurred renewed efforts to get the South Carolina state government to stop flying the Stars and Bars, which is actually not the official Confederate flag, um, on state government property. Now, I completely agree that the state government should stop doing just that. It should cease and desist from flying that flag. It is inherently a racist symbol. And what I want to discuss with you today are two questions that I think you should ask by way of argument anytime this subject comes up, in order to illustrate the point that the Stars and Bars is, in fact, an inherently racist symbol and not merely a symbol of heritage rather than hate, as many of those who like to fly the flag nowadays are fond of claiming. The first question you should ask when you hear someone claim that it's about heritage, not hate, is this: if it's really about heritage rather than hate, then why did that particular flag actually not come to be adopted by the Confederate States of America as its official flag? Why did no state government within the Confederacy ever adopt that flag as its official symbol? Why, in fact, did that flag not come to be used on a widespread basis until the early 20th century, when the Ku Klux Klan began to display it as a symbol of white supremacy and resistance to racial equality and racial integration? If it really is about heritage and not hate, then why were the first people ever to use it on a widespread basis white supremacists who made no bones about the fact that they were using it as a symbol of white supremacy? That's a very telling question. Chances are the people with whom you're arguing won't have a good answer for it, because many of them aren't even aware, unfortunately, that that's the history of the Stars and Bars. Many of them are not aware that it never was actually the official flag of the Confederacy or any of the states of the Confederacy. Many of them are not aware that it was simply a battle flag carried into battle by certain Confederate military units rather than by the Confederate military as a whole, or the Confederate government, or the Confederate States of America as a whole. Also, many of them don't realize that it was really the Ku Klux Klan that popularized the use and the display of the flag. So that's the first question you should ask. And if you provide the factual, historical evidence to back up that question, if you provide the evidentiary, factual basis for it, you will probably have a leg up on your opponent in the argument. The second question you should ask is conditional, because you should really only ask it if the conversation degenerates into an argument over whether the Confederacy's real cause in the Civil War was slavery or merely states' rights. Now, I'm giving you this advice because, in my experience, the conversation often ends up in that very place. You often will end up arguing over whether the war was about slavery or states' rights. Here's the question you should ask: what states' rights? Specifically, what were these states' rights that the southern states were supposedly trying to vindicate by seceding from the Union in 1860 and 61? I say you should ask that question because I have never, in many arguments, many iterations of this argument that I've encountered over the years, I have never once heard a Confederate apologist specify which particular states' rights were supposedly being threatened by the northern states or by the federal government in the run-up to the Civil War. I mean, if I were complaining about governments violating individual rights, and someone were to challenge me on it and say, well, Akil, get specific. What individual rights is the government or are governments threatening? I would say, well, governments are threatening property rights by, for example, abusing the power of eminent domain, taking people's homes away from them or their businesses to turn them over to developers to make a quick buck off them. I would say police forces and prosecutors are abusing the power of civil asset forfeiture, robbing people blind of their property, essentially, so that they can sell the property at public auction and make a killing from the proceeds. I might say that public colleges and universities across the United States are threatening the right to free speech, specifically by implementing speech codes and by establishing speech zones on campus, outside of which the right to free speech is unconstitutionally restricted. I would give those specific, concrete examples of specific individual rights that governments are threatening or violating. But how often in these arguments about the Civil War do you hear Confederate apologists getting specific and delving into the details of which states' rights the federal government or the northern states were supposedly violating before the Civil War? Well, guess what? You don't usually hear them specifying it because it wasn't about states' rights. I mean, never mind the fact that, states don't have rights anyway. Governments don't have rights. They have authority, they have powers, they have spheres of jurisdiction, but they don't have rights. Right? Rights are for private, citizens and individual private organizations that are made up of individual private citizens. They have rights. Governments have powers. Two different stories altogether. But even if you take that issue and put it on the back burner and, entertain this idea of states' rights, the idea that the South went to war over states' rights rather than slavery is nonsense. I mean, we have plenty of historical evidence in the form of statements by Confederate leaders and secessionist leaders to the effect that, slavery was exactly the cause for which they were fighting. The whole conflict between North and South that erupted in the 1850s in particular centered on the question of expansion of slavery into the territories that the country had just acquired, particularly through the Mexican War in 1848. That was, the sticking point. It was all about slavery and how far slavery would be able to expand into the territories. What's more, the idea that the southern states believe in states' rights is a little bit dubious, actually very highly dubious, when you consider that they got the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 passed, which obligated northern states to, participate in the process of tracking down escaped slaves and returning them to their owners. Now, that meant that even if northern states wanted no part of slavery, of the institution of slavery, the southern states were forcing them, using the power of the federal government, no less, to force the authorities in northern states, law enforcement agencies in non-slave states, to be complicit in the perpetuation of the institution of slavery by forcing them to help track down runaway slaves and return them to their owners, return them into bondage. So, I mean, the whole idea that it was about states' rights rather than slavery is completely ahistorical. It's totally inaccurate. It's completely and utterly false. And even a cursory examination of the historical record will make that clear. So that's, a good way to illustrate that point, or to lead into the illustration of that point, is simply to ask Confederate apologists, what states' rights? Get specific. What specific states' rights were Washington or the northern states supposedly violating? Chances are they won't have an answer for you, because there is no answer to that question. The truth is, it wasn't about states' rights, it was all about slavery. And the Confederate leaders, the secessionist leaders, said as much at the time. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, for example, in his infamous Cornerstone speech, actually said very plainly at the outset of the war, or before the outset of the war, he said, the principle on which this Confederacy is being founded is the principle that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that subordination to the superior race is his just and moral condition. I am paraphrasing slightly when I say that, but only so much. At the time, Confederate leaders didn't make any bones about the fact that they were trying to preserve, perpetuate, and expand the institution of slavery. It was only after they lost the war and were forced back into the Union that they and their apologists began cooking up this states' rights rationale after the fact to try to legitimize and rehabilitate the secessionist image after the war as a historical matter. It's a myth. Don't buy into it, and don't be afraid to use the questions that I've recommended here to expose the mythical nature of this heritage not hate or states' rights not slavery nonsense, because that's precisely what it is. Take this wisdom and put it to good use. Use it wisely, my apprentices. Signing off.